So from Moscow to Berlin is a short hop across that contested sphere of influence on Europe's eastern marches, the arc of the former Soviet Union states, from the Baltic through the Ukraine, Belarus down to the Balkans. Discomfortingly short for many Europeans. It might be quite useful to remember that Moscow and Berlin are closer than Washington and Kansas City. It really isn't a very great distance. It's also worth remembering, of course, that Europe has many capitals. The EU has 28 alone, soon to be 27, of course. And on top of that, there is Brussels, and there's another score of non-EU capitals in Europe. So plenty of perspectives on Washington, and plenty of divergent perspectives as well. Europe is certainly not one place. But if anything has united many of the leaders in those capitals, it was probably the disdain and disbelief in which candidate Trump was held by many of the European ruling political class during the election. That turned to, and I'm pleased for the second time today to be able to use the word discombobulation, which is one of my favorite words. Graham introduced us to it earlier. But there was both, I think, discombobulation and discomfort after the election of Donald Trump. And of course, much eating of previously issued scornful words. There was a need for a lot of rowing back to be done from Berlin through to the Atlantic. So I have with me today two experts from our global network who know the chancelleries of Europe extremely well, and particularly the ones that matter, Berlin, London, Brussels, Paris. And they will help us pick our way through the multiple views of Washington that exist in Europe. So on my right here is Hartmut Meyer. He's a fellow in politics at St. Peter's College in Oxford and an adjunct professor in European studies at Johns Hopkins here in the States. And is one of our senior advisors at Oxford Analytica on European affairs. And on my left, your right, Eric Bratberg, who directs the Europe program at the Carnegie Endowment, where he's also a fellow. And of course, again, you will find full details of distinguished careers and scholarship in the brochures you have. I will do exactly the same thing as we did with Russia. I'll ask each of them to make some short introductory remarks to calibrate the lenses through which European leaders are looking at Washington, and then we'll broaden the discussion and open it up to the floor. And again, I've asked each of them to couch their introductory remarks in terms of what were the expectations in Europe when it woke up to what to many in Europe was the startling news that Donald Trump had been elected as President of the United States, and now 100 days into the Trump presidency, what that view looks like now. And with that, I will ask Eric to get our discussion underway. Eric,
Great.
Please.
Well, thanks, Paul, and good afternoon, and great to be here with all of you, and especially with this beautiful backdrop on a beautiful day that's actually not too hot and humid and for being Washington this time of the year. I think you set it up really nicely, Paul, highlighting the concerns that Europeans had about candidate Trump and now President Trump. I would even go further. I think there's been sort of a collective, almost freak-out moment in Europe ever since he announced his candidacy on June 16th, 2015. And as Europeans watched the race within the Republican Party, they found it almost unfathomable that this person who was a billionaire, a real estate tycoon with no political experience whatsoever, could beat 16 other candidates, including senators and governors, becoming the Republican candidate and successfully being elected president in November 8th, 2016. Now, 6 months ago, and 100 days into the Trump presidency, where does Europe stand? How does it look at all of this? I think it's useful to take a step back and as Paul suggested, look at the expectations that Europe had. Obviously, there were lots of concerns about the rhetoric from candidate Trump on the campaign trail, especially pertaining to NATO, the famous remarks about NATO being obsolete, about U.S. conditioning its support to Article 5 based on NATO countries spending on defense, of the notions that Putin, and we heard this in the last panel, potentially cutting a deal, a grand bargain with Russia, sort of over Europe's head, removing sanctions against Russia, perhaps recognizing Crimea. These were all things that were floating around during the campaign, coming from the Trump team's campaign. But there were also, of course, remarks about the European Union, very disparaging remarks about the European project, support both explicitly and implicitly for Brexit, and there were fears in Europe that the American candidate, Donald Trump, would no longer support the European project, which has been, of course, a long-standing US policy in Europe. I think on trade, there were also great concerns that the US would turn towards protectionism and sort of an anti-globalization stance. Trump spoke very strongly out against both NAFTA, which I think he called the worst trade deal in the history, and TPP. He didn't say much about TTIP, but I think there were great concerns in a lot of European capitals about sort of US perhaps taking a step back from its traditional role in sort of maintaining the global economic system. And then I think finally there were also concerns about the broader US global leadership role and upholding what some of us call the international liberal order and the norms and the laws that sort of guide international affairs. His comments about the United Nations, again, comments about the Bretton Woods system, dismissing international norms and dismissing international law, threatening to cut development and soft power efforts. So these were all of the concerns that Europe had going into the election. Fast forwarding 100 days, we're now in May 2017. Where does Europe stand? I think there's still, frankly, a whole lot of uncertainty. I think there's a lot of question marks, but I do think overall that there is maybe a little bit less of a sense of freaking out than we had in November of last year. I think in particular, when we're talking about defense and NATO, I think especially the Eastern European countries, the Baltics, Poland, feel a little bit more reassured today, or probably a whole lot more reassured today than it did in November, that the US commitment to Article 5 remains steadfast, that the US is still committed to NATO. Trump is still talking very tough about NATO spending. He's going to go to NATO in about 3 weeks, and he's going to demand more spending from Europe. So he is talking very tough, but I think the US commitment is still there. And I think there's also I think Europeans are less concerned that somehow this grand bargain would happen, that the US would somehow become buddies with Putin and pull back sanctions and abandon Ukraine and work with Russia as opposed to NATO. I think that there's, if anything, US and Russia are further away today than they were before, and I think we see that certainly in Syria, even more so after the recent strikes there. So I think that's sort of certainly the sense across NATO, but maybe especially the Eastern European countries, the ones that are exposed to Russia, are feeling the most reassured at this point. I think in Brussels and how the EU views this, I think there's actually quite a lot of concern. I mean, we had Donald Tusk saying that with Trump, the US is now a threat against the European Union alongside Russia and ISIS. This was, of course, a couple of months ago. And subsequently, we've had successful trips by Pence and Tillerson to Brussels, basically committing US continued support to the European Union. And also President Trump, in meeting the Italian Prime Minister recently, said that a strong Europe is in America's interest. But there's still concerns, of course, about how engaged the US will be with the EU as such. Yeah. It looks like it will continue to work with individual European capitals, and in particularly with Berlin. And speaking of Berlin, and Hartmut will, of course, speak more about this, I think there is both a sense of engaging Trump, and we've seen Merkel being very active on that. She had a very successful trip here. She invited, of course, the president's daughter to Berlin. But there's also question marks, especially, I think, on the president's economic policies and how that will affect Germany with things like adjustment border tax, singling out Germany as a currency manipulator. So there's still some concerns there. And then, so I think, broadly speaking, engagement, but also not being seen as engaging too much for domestic political purposes with the German election coming up in September. And I think we can speak to the other capitals as we start having the conversation. Okay. I'll just wrap up by saying that I think, in general, my view is that it's really too soon to tell what this administration policies towards Europe really means. There's still a lack of key personnel in key foreign policy positions across the government. There hasn't really been a formulation of policy and priorities yet. This is still very much in the making. So we should avoid generalizing too much based on isolated events. And I think many of the decisions, frankly, have been sort of ad hoc and very much personality driven. But overall, I do sense a perhaps a moderation from at least the very stark language that we heard during the campaign, but it still remains to be seen where that is going to go. And I think that leaves Europe obviously feeling that it has mixed messages. We're going to continue to see misunderstanding, mistrust and skepticism from Europe. And I think what they're really looking for, especially as Donald Trump will descend on Europe on multiple occasions in the next few months, attending the G7 meeting in Italy, attending NATO summit end of this month, and attending the G20 in Hamburg in July, is really not just words, but really deeds and demonstrations of continued US commitment to Europe.
So Europe still feels very much in the middle.
Yeah.
Good, thank you. Hartmut, can you pick up
I
from there?
fully agree with the general overview we have heard, and I have no disagreement. I just want to point out a few things to emphasize how much uncertainty there is by making some bold statements. One bold statement is we are buying time in 2017. The big shock is gone. We are in a period where we think we can do business in one form or the other, but we are in a period of political theater because Germany is in election mode, Britain is in election mode, France is in election mode, we will have Italy in election mode, and so on. And we are in a period of trying to find partners to engage with, while the level of political gaming is a separate game. Now, my next statement is, and therefore, this is the year of the officials and business communities and civil societies. It's actually finding the right links of channeling the communication, the level below the political leaders. And this is particularly challenging because with other administrations you had, through party links, through previous political experience and so on, established communication lines. With this administration, some of the key positions are not filled and the traditional friends are not part of this game. And what is happening throughout is everyone searching for the right person, the right communication channel, and it's not Ivanka only. It is finding that, and I think that's a general European reaction to where we are. The next statement is no one is more shocked and no one is more affected than Berlin. Yeah. Partly because it shares all the views that you have highlighted, but it has something to do with Berlin's position. Everything German foreign policy stood for is challenged by Trump in one form or the other. Multilateralism, NATO as the security umbrella, an economic order that plays by the rules. TTIP was unpopular on both sides, but one of the attractions was that it's an anchor of global trade, which is regulated, which Europe and America jointly can use to set standards that others then have to buy in. This is questioned. The EU, NATO you mentioned, that's questioned. An export-oriented country such as Germany, the BMW example, which is always isolated, really hits the German business community, and it's a real challenge. If Erdogan is a challenge, if Putin is a challenge, the Germans always rely to the Americans to coordinate this together with Putin. You can't do Minsk without the Americans, even if you're in the driving seat. You need to have that backup. If you want to control Erdogan, NATO is the mechanism, and without the Americans coming in there, it's a problem. So the Berlin situation, not only as the reluctant leader in Europe, but also the expectations raised by the New York Times and so on. Angela Merkel is now the last standing free trader, and all the burden of global politics is on her shoulders. The Transatlantic Academy in the German Marshall Fund had a good piece for a reversal from the geo-economic to the geopolitical. It used to be Germany geo-economic and America geopolitical. Now it is the reverse. And all the challenges, another piece they produced was on multilateralism in one country, i.e. Berlin, the only one that advocates multilateralism, while the Russians, the Turks, Trump, Brexit, Hungary, Poland, all advocating something different, which puts a lot of burden on their shoulders. Having said that, there are 5 conflicting views in Berlin, and they're not conflicting. This is an analysis of the same person. This is Trump the ridiculous. This is the locker room talk and all that, but also the ridiculous, in a sense, the naivety about politics. I didn't know health reform was so difficult to get through. Saying to Angela Merkel, I want to do business with you, a bilateral trade agreement with Germany, not knowing that you can't do this within the EU, and him saying it 6 times. So the ridiculous, which is one language, and then the political naive is another one. Trump the volatile, he changes positions on a lot of things. Trump the dangerous, Trump the deal maker, and Trump the narcissist who wants to be loved. And the challenge is to tip into the 5 Trumps in a constructive way. The ridiculous we can't do much about. The volatile, we have to catch the right moments to find constructive policies which are ad hoc. The dangerous is the one that you want to contain, and I think there is a lot of trust in Europe in the American political system and the checks and balances that somehow he will not turn out as dangerous and as bad as we expected. The deal maker is a difficult one because, as I said, no one had experience with Trump other than the business community. And I know a lot of people who were in banking and were involved when Trump had difficulties with his empire, and they were trying to buy a Trump Tower, they were trying to do deals, and they met the man in a deal-making room, and they don't trust him. He wasn't the great deal maker, he was actually a very suspicious one, pompous, not honest, this and that, and the business community feeds that through the channels into the political community, and that kind of fear is there. But the narcissist, he wants to be loved. That, I think they want to play on so that you find a constructive engagement with him and that he's doing good for the world, not only for America. I think they can play on that. And the challenge, to sum up, is to find the right communication channels to overcome the political theater that we see because of electioneering, and then find ways of cooperation which is ad hoc from autumn 2017 onwards, and then engaging with North Korea, with Syria, with Russia, on trade and NATO and so on. There's cooperation. But I think that's the strategy that we can expect from Europe. I'm happy to talk about London and Paris separately, but invite questions either from Paul or from the audience.
Okay, let us just, we'll get to London in a second, but let's just drill down a little more into the BMW issue, because it's quite a good lens through which to look at the trade issues. I think if you asked most people in the US, which was the leading exporter of American-made cars, they would not say BMW, although BMW is the answer. So can you just drill down into that a little further and explain how that illustrates the trade issues?
The Trump narrative, we are cheated by the Chinese and by the Germans, and look at the car industry and so on. We need to stop this. America first. They are destroying our jobs and so on. I think from a German perspective, this is not only wrong, but this has to be addressed because from national interest point of view, every 7th job in Germany or 8th job depends on the success of the car industry, such a key industry, but also to point out how much investment there is, how much production there is, and then by opening up trade, you can also save jobs rather than the one-sided narrative to destroy jobs. And then if we really believe in an open trade system, I think the emphasis that if the Americans and the Europeans cannot embrace the same values, cannot set the same standards for global trade, no one else can, or the alternative is much worse. And I think that message, which was part of the TTIP deal, I think has to be communicated at every single level of the engagement between Europe and America.
And I think it has been, just to come in on that. I mean, I think Merkel did a good job in sort of explaining this to Trump. The Danish Prime Minister, actually, when he was here, from what I've heard, did a very good job of explaining why trade with the European Union not only is a bilateral trade negotiation, but it also serves America's both economic interest, but also broader strategic interest. And I actually think that we're moving towards, again, more of a moderation when it comes to the Trump administration's trade policies. I think that has to do with personalities, perhaps the decline of more economic nationalists in the White House like Steve Bannon, but also Peter Navarro, who is very hawkish on trade, and the rise perhaps of more moderate forces, Gary Kong, for instance, the new USTR representative once he is confirmed by the Senate. So I would hope that we would, and I think we will see a somewhat softer tone on trade. And I actually think that after the German elections, perhaps, that there could be an opportunity to revisit transatlantic trade, not necessarily in the form of TTIP. I think that train has already left the station a long time ago, but in some other fashion. And we heard that from Minister Schäuble, the German finance minister, when he was in town a few weeks ago, that he hopes to see I think he referred to it as a more simple and less complex TTIP trade agreement with the United States eventually take place.
Let's talk a little more about London now. Clearly, the UK has always held to have a special relationship with Washington. That special relationship has become either more relevant if you are from the UK or less relevant if you are from the US as a result of Brexit. But how do you think that London is looking and the May government is looking at Washington at this point?
Well, I think the May government were very active in engaging the Trump administration from day one. She was the first European leader to actually visit with the president, and from what we understand had a successful meeting. But I do think that there are concerns, of course, about this. I think certainly how, and it's important to remember too, of course, that before May came, actually the first European leader at all to meet with the elected President Trump was, of course, Nigel Farage in the Trump Tower.
Yes, indeed, yeah.
The day after Election Day. I do think that sort of very much of this notion that the UK can leave the EU and pivot to the US and sort of have a renaissance for the special relationship, I think people are realizing is going to be even harder under this American president, partially because it will be unpopular at home, but also because this president really seems to be looking towards Germany, in my view. It's sort of a continuation, actually, of what we saw during the Obama administration. He's had more phone calls with Merkel than any other European leader. So I think that sort of illustrates the lesser relevance of London in Washington in general. And I think that's going to continue under this administration. And I don't expect that to change. And this notion, of course, Trump flirted with the US-UK FTA during the campaign. I think the political realities are hitting both sides of the Atlantic, that it's going to be hard to get any FTA done in this town for the moment, but I think also uncertainties surrounding the UK's ability to enter into an FTA negotiation while it's still a member of the EU is sort of, we're all realizing that, whether it's in London or Washington. So I think sort of the perspective from London is less optimistic today than it were a few months ago.
It's actually interesting that the UK's largest single country trading partner is already the USA, with whom it has no trade agreement at all. But so maybe you don't need these things anyway.
I might point that out. In your briefing document, you have an excellent brief on exactly UK-US, which summarizes the general argument. What I want to point out is that everything you see in the next 1.5 years in terms of foreign policy from the UK is very much influenced by the Brexit narrative, which is the overriding domestic and international one. And on the Brexit one, as I said, there's political theater. You want to send the message it's not a real problem. We can do free trade agreements with our old friends, in particular the special relationship, but also in the Commonwealth. Theresa May travels to the Gulf Cooperation Council, says we can do a deal, and so on. There's a lot of bluff and a lot of optimism in this game, and as we all know, the trade agreements are much more complicated than just making a deal. But from a political point of view, she needs that narrative in order to project a post-Brexit positive economic development. I think we should see it through this lens, and the real problems will come. It irritates the EU because a lot of things that Britain, in the context of the negotiations, tries to do unilaterally irritates that. And I think the most important foreign policy decision is how the Brexit negotiations will be conducted, and that has implications for all foreign relations for the next 2 years, and then we are in a different game. But I just want to point that out.
And I think there are also concerns that the Brexit negotiations will consume London for the next at least 2 years and will make it less of a useful foreign policy partner to the United States. And I think it's obviously something we've seen in the past few years, maybe especially France emerging as the predominant special partner of the United States when it comes to military operations, be it in the Middle East or North Africa or in the Sahel. And I think that's, at least with the Macron win, would likely to continue to be the case, and London facing challenges to remain an active military player, but also the budget constraints of being able to afford doing so.